Hi everyone, and welcome back to Allied Health 102. Um, this is our last few chapters, okay? So remember, like I said, we will not have an individual test for chapters 1, part 2, chapters 2 and 3, okay? You are responsible for the material because there may be some questions from chapters 1, part 2, chapters 2 and 3 on your comprehensive final. Not just that, guys. Things like professional ethics, regulatory issues, and things dealing directly with phlebotomy practice are vitally important to you, not only for this class, but for Allied Health 211, and also when you're out doing your clinicals and working as a phlebotomist. Remember, we always want to make sure we are acting as a professional, we're using professional ethics, we are following legal guidelines and regulatory issues, okay? So as always, we start out talking about our learning objectives, right? And here's a listing of your learning objectives. They're also listed in the front chapters of your textbook. Guys, please make sure you have read all of chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, okay? Because you need to understand that after you study these chapters, you, the learner, should be able to do all of the following things, including defining basic ethical and legal terms and being able to list common issues in lawsuits against healthcare providers and prevention tips to avoid lawsuits in phlebotomy. Remember, the law now says ignorance of the law doesn't get you off the hook. And remember, they can not only sue the hospital or clinic that you're working at, they can sue you personally. Okay? So let's start off with talking about some basic terms. Like I've always told you guys, you need to understand what these words truly mean. Okay? For you to be able to communicate effectively with your co-workers, doctors, nurses, to be able to communicate effectively with your patients and your patients' families, and for you to be able to understand what your co-workers are saying to you, you need to understand these terms and what they mean. So let's start between the difference between laws, ethics, and bioethics, okay? So laws are those rules set up in societies, right, or regulations that are advisable or you have to observe them, okay? And we all know that when you have, people don't like laws. I understand a lot of people don't like societal rules, but for us to function, we have over, 300 million people living in the United States of America. For us to all live together harmoniously, we have to follow certain rules and regulations, okay? Then we have ethics, right? Those are those moral standards of behavior or conduct that govern an individual's actions, okay? That's that moral compass inside you that we all should have, and that when we're going to do things, if there's something inside of us that's telling us that this is not standard behavior, we need to stop and question this, correct? And then bioethics. These are the moral issues or problems that have resulted because of modern medicine, clinical research, or technology. These are things that are specific to healthcare, okay? So usually bioethics is talking about the life and death issues such as abortion, when a patient should be allowed to die, and who receives organ donations. But that's just the tip of it. There is more, right? So all healthcare workers are faced with ethical decisions at one time or another during their professional career. So to evaluate a difficult situation, ask yourself, is it legal and does it comply with the institutional policy? Guys, these are questions that you should be asking yourself, okay? Does it foster a win-win situation? How would I or my family feel if I read about this situation in a newspaper? And can I live with myself after making this decision? And frankly, you say to yourself, is it right? Think about all those times that you've read stories about how healthcare professionals have mistreated the elderly, and you were appalled. You read this story and you were totally appalled how someone could mistreat an elderly person. make sure that when you're out there taking care of your patients, whether they're elderly or not, whether they're children or not, that you're really asking yourself these questions to make sure that you're making the correct ethical decisions. So these are one of our little slides where you want to read this, you want to pause it, read through it, analyze the situation, and see if you're coming up with the correct answers. Always, guys, always. If you realize that you've made any mistake whatsoever, you need to immediately report it, okay? Never falsify documents. And if you write a time of 12:05 on a specimen when you know you drew it at 12:25, you are falsifying documentation. And if something were to happen to that patient because of it, and they were to go back and realize, due to cameras or whatever there may be, that you actually went into that room to draw that blood at around 12:23, so that you couldn't have drawn it at 12:05, and that patient died as a result because medicine was given or not given, then you could be personally held responsible for it, and that family could sue you. So there's bills of rights, right? There's rights and responsibilities. So the patient's bill of rights, or patient's care partnership, as of 2003, involves patients' rights to the following. They have a right to high quality hospital care. They have a right to a clean and safe environment. They have a right to be involved in their care. They have a right to privacy. They have a right to help when leaving the hospital, and they have a right to help with billing. The legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government control laws. Now, we understand that the executive branch is the president, right? The legislative branch is our Senate and our House of Representatives, and our judicial branch is the Supreme Court at the federal level. When you start going down, you have the governor, who is the executive branch of your state. Your legislature is your senators and congressmen having to do with your state, and your judicial branch is the federal. You have a Louisiana State Supreme Court, and there's different branches of this going all the way down to your mayors and your city council, okay? Then the legislative branch of government's written laws are called statutes, okay? And they're made at, like I said, you have stuff at the federal branch of government, the state branch of government, and even down to like Caddo and Bossier, the county levels, or as parishes, as we say here in Louisiana. So for centuries, the decision of the physician was unquestioned. This has changed. Healthcare consumers have become more aware, more critical, and more willing to sue even healthcare workers who are collecting blood specimens. An understanding of basic legal concepts is important. Liability for the lack of proper standard of care may be imposed on any healthcare worker. Now, again, terminology. We need to understand the terminology. And so here's some legal terminology you guys need to know. This could be on your comprehensive final, right? Assault, okay? An attempt to touch another person, of course, when they don't want you to, right? Administrative law is the implementation of ordinance by the executive branch. Judicial law is functions to resolve disputes in accordance with the law. So in other words, you go to court and you have a dispute, and the judicial law is to take that law and be able to apply it to whatever situation is being heard in their court. A battery is the intentional touching of another person. Civil law is not a criminal action. The plaintiff sues for money. Criminal actions are legal recourse for acts or offenses against the public welfare. These actions can lead to imprisonment of the offender. Our defendant is the person or place against whom the lawsuit is filed. So the defendant could be you, or the defendant could be the hospital, or be both. Okay? So remember, you need to understand, defend your position, right? You may need to defend your position. The hospital or clinic may need to defend their position. False imprisonment. We've all heard about this before, right? The unjustifiable detention of persons without a legal warrant. A felony is a public offense in which the person spends time in jail. We've heard of invasion of privacy, right? That's the unauthorized release of information against a patient in our setting in hospitals. Liable is under legal obligation for damages. You are liable to pay somebody for the damages that happen to them. Then there's litigation process. That's the legal action to determine a decision in court. Many cases are negotiated and settled out of court, but the entire litigation process is whether you go and you discuss it and the decision gets made to settle for a certain amount of money or a certain action and it never goes to court, or the litigation process could be going all the way to court, arguing the case, and then the decision being made. Malice and malpractice. Now, malice is knowing a statement is false or making a statement with reckless disregard for the truth. Okay? And that reckless disregard for the truth is important because you're showing true malice. You made a false statement knowing it wasn't true. Malpractice is the improper or unskilled care of a patient where you show neglect. Okay, so a misdemeanor. We talked about different ones. Misdemeanors are all sorts of criminal offenses that are seen as not serious enough to be classified as a felony. So if found guilty, the defendant is usually fined and not put in jail. Versus if it's a felony, most of the time, not always, they can spend time in jail. Misrepresentation is the use of misleading information or omission of important facts. Okay, guys, so we're still talking about the terminology, right, which is important. So, res ipsa loquitur. That's the doctrine that states the thing speaks for itself, okay? It's applied when the plaintiff is injured in such a way that he or she cannot prove how it occurred. It usually is applied when the injured party was in surgery, unconscious, or was an infant, okay? Now, we have a plaintiff, right? And we talked about a defendant. The defendant was defend your place, right? You're the defendant, so you have to defend yourself. And the defendants, a lot of times, are hospital clinics, and they can be healthcare workers. They can sue the hospital and the healthcare worker. So we understand what the defendant is. The plaintiff is the claimant who brings the lawsuit, okay? The person with the complaint, right? That would be the patient usually, right? And then negligence is the failure to act or perform according to the standards of the profession. Guys, make sure you understand this legal terminology. Because when you understand what the words means, it gives you power. Knowledge is power. Then when people speak to you and they use these words, you understand fully what they're saying, and then you can intelligently speak to others. Respondent superior, that's the action of one person or imputed to another person having control. So under this concept, supervisors and directors may be held liable for the neglect and actions of their employees. Okay, so make sure you understand that. A subpoena, we've heard of these before, court order for a person and documents to be brought to court proceedings. If you're subpoenaed to come to court, then by law you have to come to court. And if they ask you to bring certain documents with you, you have to. Tort is a legal wrong for which one is liable for damages in civil action. The defendant does not go to jail. So we're talking about negligence, right? So we want to talk about the factors that must be considered in negligent cases. First, we're talking about duty. It relates to what duties or responsibilities the hospital or healthcare worker had towards the patient and that they used the appropriate standard of care. We see this picture where this doctor is listening to this baby's heart and says, I should follow up on this heart murmur, but I'm too busy. It is the duty of that physician to follow up on that heart murmur to make sure that they are properly taking care of that patient, and it's the patient's right to get proper health care. A lot of times, if you are too busy to follow up on something, you need to make sure you alert your supervisor or the nurse in charge of that patient, so you make sure that someone has the time to follow up on these issues dealing with the patient, because it is your duty. Breach of duty, right? It relates to whether the duty was breached and if it was avoidable. The plaintiff must show what actually happened and that the defendant acted unreasonably. Foreseeability. This relates to the concept that certain events may reasonably be expected to cause specific results. For example, using a long, large needle to collect blood from an elderly patient will lead to vein damage and hematoma. That's foreseeable. You are taught not to do that. And in court, they're going to show that in your education, in your training, and when you took your certification exam, that questions relating to this were given to you, you answered them correctly, which proves that you knew that this was the improper way to handle this, and you did it anyway. Okay? Proximate causation. This relates to whether the breach of duty actually contributed to or caused injury. It may be proven in the case of neglect. So a lot of times they can show that what you did could have caused the injury. Injury or harm, right? The demonstration that an actual physical injury occurred. Then we have damages. This relates to whether the plaintiff was actually injured and when these injuries were disclosed. Always record the time and when the injury occurred. A healthcare worker collected blood from a patient. The needle went through the vein into the median nerve. The healthcare worker continued attempting to get the blood despite the patient's complaints, and the patient subsequently lost the use of 3 fingers in the hand due to the nerve damage. This is why when you hear a patient complaining like that, you want to immediately pop that tourniquet and get out of that vein. And then you want to follow the proper procedures and make sure that you file an incident report. Because if this was unforeseeable and it was an accident and you immediately took care of it in the correct way, then you can lessen the amount of problems later on down the line. Malpractice or professional neglect is the improper or unskillful care of a patient by a member of a healthcare profession. Misconduct or unreasonable lack of skill. Now we're going to talk about HIPAA, and I know you all have heard of HIPAA before, right? It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it requires that healthcare providers obtain a patient's written consent before disclosing medical information for routine uses such as diagnosis, treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. This includes the electronic transfer of medical information, such as an electronic transfer through a computer or even a fax machine. This medical information is referred to as Protected Healthcare Information, PHI. Okay, guys, we're still talking about patient confidentiality, which is vitally important. Remember, the negligent cases can and have arisen out of violation of patient confidentiality, right? This is information whose disclosure is prohibited by law, okay? It's not just the healthcare people telling you not to do it because it's the wrong thing to do. This is literally a law. You will be breaking the law, okay? No one except the patient may release patient results without a clinical need to know. Confidential materials, including communications between the physician and the patient's verbal statements, computer entries on patients, and nonverbal communications such as laboratory test results. Okay? All this stuff is included. In some states, laws allow the healthcare workers to know the identity of a patient who has AIDS or who is HIV positive. Louisiana laws allows you to know. But you have to remember, you are made aware of this information that is still confidential, just so you will know due to your exposure to HIV. But you still are responsible for keeping that patient's information confidential. Here's another one of our situations that helps us think, right? We take what we learn in lab and lecture and put it together to see if we would be making those correct decisions out there in the field. So pause this, read through this slide, and see if you're getting the correct answers. Remember, we treat every reagent, every control, every patient, whether they're a newborn or a 100-year-old person, as if their blood or body fluids could be infectious. Okay? What should you do if you have an exposure incident? Okay? We've talked about these before in lab. So healthcare, home healthcare. Okay? So let's look at different settings. Okay? So in the home healthcare, you obtain the patient's HIV status and other potentially infectious diseases. You ensure proper, immediate, and long-term self-protective steps. If you're employed in a healthcare facility, you follow the guidelines established by that facility. Also be aware, if you're working for a home health agency, most of those agencies are also going to have established guidelines for incidents such as this. If you are self-employed, you need to monitor your own HIV status. But if you are self-employed through some type of contract work, I would make sure I worked with whomever you're doing that contract work with to set up some type of exposure plan or to see if they have an exposure plan. Remember, you should advocate for your own health care, including your safety on the job. Now we're going to talk about standard of care. So if a patient suffers injuries due to improper blood collection, the patient must show the healthcare worker failed to meet the proper standard of care. So what are 5 ways standard of care can be established? We have statutes, licensing requirements, rules and regulations of professional organizations, internal healthcare facility rules, and professional publications. So in other words, statutes that are set up with your laws, right, in your parish, in your city, in your state, in the nation, these are things that we must follow because this sets the standard of care. And if we go outside those laws or statutes, then the plaintiff can show that we did not meet proper standard of care. When you take the ASCP licensure, okay, it has certain requirements that you have to meet before you can ever sit for that exam, which shows that you were taught all the things you need to know to be a professional phlebotomist. If you were taught the right way to do something and you step outside that and you don't do it the proper way, then the plaintiff can show that you stepped outside of it and you did not give them proper standard of care. There's rules and regulations for different professional organizations, same thing. The healthcare facility that you work at will have rules and regulations and policies and procedures that you are supposed to follow. If you personally decide not to follow those policies and procedures, let's just to say that you decide it's too much work for you to make sure that you follow proper aseptic technique when drawing your blood cultures. It's a lot of work, and you don't want to have to draw it in the right arm and go through all that aseptic technique, wait 30 minutes later, come back and draw it in the other arm and go through all that aseptic technique. That's just too much time and work, and you're busy. So you're just going to kind of sort of do the aseptic technique, draw both of them, and then just write it down that you drew them 30 minutes apart in a different arm. You are stepping outside that standard of care. Now you have left yourself personally wide open to a lawsuit. And if that patient were to die and they were to sue the hospital, if those lawyers who are trained for looking for that type of thing find out that you stepped outside the standard of care by not following directions, they can sue you personally. So always make sure you follow all laws, all your requirements that you were taught, all the rules and regulations for your profession and your health care facility. Let's talk about informed consent. Okay, informed consent is voluntary permission by a patient to allow touching, examination, and/or treatment by a healthcare worker, which would include drawing blood. Minors must have informed consent of a parent, and unconscious patients have IC from the closest relative. Okay, someone has to give you informed consent if it's a minor, and someone has to give you informed consent if the patient is unconscious. You cannot just go into that room and start performing a procedure on that patient without informed consent. An adult with the mental capacity of a child must have informed consent from their assigned guardian. Those with a foreign language must have an interpreter, and most states require informed consent before HIV blood collection and testing. Extending an arm or rolling up a sleeve is considered informed consent. So if you set your patient down, you introduce yourself, so you're going to tell them what your name is, where you're from, and what you're there for. You get them to ID themselves, and they extend their arm out to you and roll their sleeve up. Then they are aware of what you're doing because you've told them, my name is Melissa, I'm from the lab, I'm here to draw your blood. Now they know who you are, where you're from, and what you're doing. If they extend their arm, then they're giving you informed consent. Now let's talk about informed consent for research purposes, right? Because of unethical treatment of humans in the past, such as the Tuskegee experiment, a law was passed which established the IRB, which is the Institutional Research Board, okay, or boards, to review and approve research proposals. Research now requires informed consent, including full disclosure, which explains the full nature of the research and all the risk involved. So if this person signs on to do, for instance, if they sign on to be one of the test subjects to take the early vaccines, they're developing a vaccine for anything from COVID to the flu, and they're developing this new vaccine. They have to test it out on humans at some point. Researchers need to use people to do this. They have to give them informed consent. The person has to say, I have been informed and I consent to having this vaccine given to me. The researchers have to give full disclosure to that patient, explaining to them the entire nature of that vaccine and all the risk involved. Once that patient is formally a research subject, is formally informed, they have all the information that they need to make a proper decision. Implied consent. Now this exists when immediate action is required to save a patient's life or to prevent permanent impairment of the patient's health, such as you see this picture of an ambulance and somebody been loading into it. If the ambulance comes up on a patient and they are harmed, implied consent would be that this patient would not want to lay on the road and die. They want you to do everything they can to save their life or to prevent them from losing a limb or being permanently damaged for the rest of their lives. What is the difference between informed consent and implied consent? This is an often missed test question. Remember, informed consent is giving the phlebotomist permission to draw the blood if they're putting their arm out there and rolling up their sleeve, or if they say, yes, you can draw my blood. That's informed consent. You inform them on what you're going to be doing, and they gave you consent verbally or physically. They understood it. They weren't an infant. They weren't mentally impaired. They weren't unconscious. They actually gave you consent. Okay, and remember, implied consent is if what you're going to do for them would possibly save their life, then that's implied consent, that they would want you to save their life, okay? Statute of limitations, okay? The statute of limitations is a law that defines how soon after an injury a plaintiff must file the lawsuit, or be forever barred from doing so. In Louisiana, as in most states, the statute of limitation is 2 years. And in other words, if something happens to that patient and they have some type of injury, they have 2 years to file a lawsuit. After 2 years, they can no longer file that lawsuit. Okay, so now let's just talk about the process, okay? So in a malpractice lawsuit, the first statement of a case by the plaintiff, and remember our plaintiff is our person complaint, right? They're filing the complaint. So the first thing they do is they file that complaint against the defendant, okay? In that complaint, it states a cause of action, and it notifies the defendant, and remember to defend yourself, right? That could be the hospital or you or both, of the reason for this specific lawsuit. So the steps of the beginning of a malpractice lawsuit, okay? The parties to a lawsuit have the right to discovery. So they have a right to examine the witnesses before the trial. Discovery consists of oral testimony under oath and includes cross-examination by the lawyers. Remember, you want to discover what they know. Any paperwork they have, anything that they have, they are supposed to release that to you during discovery so you can see what they have. That way you can prepare to defend yourself. The deposition is the testimony of a witness that has been recorded in a written legal format. The parties may undergo cross-examination, providing testimony regarding the cause for the case that will be recorded and filed. An expert witness may be used to assist a plaintiff in providing the wrongful act of a defendant or to assist the defendant in refuting such evidence. So you remember, both the defendant and the plaintiff can have expert witnesses that can speak to what they're talking about. Evidence is used to prove or disprove the lawsuit, includes such items as vacutainer tubes, tube holders, needles, safety apparatuses, and infection control logs, reports, requisition, patient logs, okay? Even video footage can be brought in. A preponderance of evidence is a majority of 51% or more. This term implies that the defendant more than likely committed the act. A preponderance of the evidence. So the majority of the evidence proves that the defendant most likely committed this act. Justice is expensive, guys. Lawyer fees typically range anywhere from $200 to $700 an hour, okay? So how do we avoid lawsuits? Document, 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 right? If you don't write it down, it did not happen. Always document the time, date, and blood collection initials on blood collection containers. Always follow your healthcare facility's procedures to the letter. And if you must deviate, discuss it with your immediate supervisor first. Remember, like I told you, there's situations like if a woman had a mastectomy on both breasts at the same time, right? Then you need to speak to that patient's nurse and doctor to figure out what they want you to do. And then that will be documented as to why you had to make that decision. It covers you to make sure you don't get in trouble, okay? Always ensure patient safety. You want to monitor your patients before and after blood collection. Are they sweating? Has their pallor changed, the color of their skin? You always want to make sure, if you don't remember if those bed rails were up, put them up anyway, okay? Always return those bed rails to the previous position. Lock patients in blood collection chairs. Y'all know when I tell you when you go back there, what's one of the critiques I make often? Move that bar around and lock them in. It helps prevent them falling out and harming themselves. If a patient says they feel faint, place them in a supine position and monitor them for 20 minutes after collection. Always give proper treatment. Use proper technique and equipment. Always make sure you're the most up to date on the skills of what's going on. You want to make sure you have continuing education. Healthcare changes. They come out with new safety devices, new procedures for doing things. They find out that there's a better, more effective way to do it. And as healthcare workers, we want to stay up to date on the best treatment for our patients. Monitoring and reporting, right? Report significant changes in a patient's conditions. If the patient continues to bleed from puncture sites after pressure is used, you either need to stay and hold pressure or immediately let the nurse know about it. An equipment use. Use corrective waste containers. Remember, think before you toss, even if you're working in home health. If you're going out to patients' homes, do not throw dirty needles in their trash. Make sure that either they have one or you bring one with you and have a sharps container for dirty sharps. Patients with HIV, how do we handle that? Do not discriminate in treatment against anyone. Be aware of possibility of nosocomial transmissions and do not breach confidentiality with HIV patients or any other patients. Respondent superior, right, is a Latin term meaning let the master answer and is a legal doctrine that holds employers responsible for acts of their employees. Not only can the injured party sue the employee, but the employer, if sued, may seek indemnification, the compensation for financial loss from the employee's act. In other words, your employer can look to you to pay for what you did incorrectly outside their direct policy and procedures, knowing that you were trained not to do it and did it anyway. So in many cases, the healthcare institution negotiates, arbitrates, and settles out of court. So let's talk about phlebotomy problems leading to phlebotomy lawsuits. Of course, that's a horrible example up there on your top over to your right of a hematoma. And that's from inadequate pressure to the vein. They did not hold pressure properly or long enough. That's why I always say, either you hold pressure or get your patient to hold pressure and make sure that that patient knows how to hold pressure and can hold pressure if you allow them to do it. If they're unable to do it, you need to get someone else to do it, okay? And you need to make sure that you get all your specimens labeled and get all that done while they're holding pressure. You do not want to just immediately apply that Coban, okay? Hold pressure for at least 15 seconds. Infections at the venipuncture site. This is from you not performing proper cleaning of the site. Injuries from fainting or falling because you didn't lock them in. You weren't paying attention to them. Okay, nerve damage because you dug around in their arm or you used improper technique, complications from drawing blood from same side as a mastectomy, and identifications errors. You did not properly ID your patient, which could lead to the wrong diagnosis, treatment, and even death of that patient. Here is an example of a true lawsuit filed against a person because of phlebotomy. A healthcare worker that was unskilled in phlebotomy inserted the needle 2 inches above the antecubital fossa of the arm. The needle went through the vein, through the muscle, into a nerve, severely injuring the patient's arm. The patient sustained permanent injury and impaired use of the arm even after 3 surgeries to repair the damage. That's why when I talk to y'all about the antecubital fossa of the arm, I always am very implicit about drawing that line in the arm and saying, no, you don't need to go up here. You need to stay down here, okay? Here's another example. So you guys pause these examples and read through them so you can see and be informed on some of the things that either untrained or unwilling healthcare professionals such as phlebotomists did that caused lawsuits and injuries. So pause this one now and read through it. Okay, now let's talk about HIV-related issues. So if a healthcare worker becomes infected with HIV during employment, The healthcare worker must demonstrate a connection between the HIV infection and his employment. The healthcare worker's lifestyle will be evaluated. If a healthcare worker resigns because of contracting AIDS, unemployment benefits may be available if the healthcare worker can show that continued employment would jeopardize his or her health. Now remember, that's the reason we always want to make sure that if we stick ourselves with a needle, whether it's dirty or not, we want to file an incident report, because this is the way we establish that connection between our employment and our infection with HIV or any other disease or injury. Let's talk about malpractice insurance, okay? There's different types. There's blanket malpractice insurance, insurance that covers workers in the hospital and laboratory. There's pathologist malpractice insurance, usually the lowest because he has so little patient contact. Most phlebotomists working in a hospital are covered by this type of insurance if you're actually working in that hospital. An individual, if you were self-employed, you might want to get malpractice insurance, usually covers attorney's fees and court costs. Make sure you keep this in mind if you are a contract worker or self-employed. So there's 7 factors that must be considered when you are thinking of purchasing your own malpractice insurance. First, you want to know, does your employer carry insurance? Most big hospitals and clinics do, but you always want to make sure you're aware of that, yes or no. The hospital or pathologist may not have your best interest in mind. Is it adequate dollar coverage? What are the limitations? Make sure you know these. What procedures must be followed to receive the coverage? And are specimens collected off-site covered as well? Guys, it is your responsibility to advocate for yourself. Don't just take for granted these things. Make sure you educate yourself. I know that reading through some of these things take time, and yes, I understand it can be boring. But to make sure that you understand, you need to make sure you know what's going on where you're working. So let's talk about CLIA, right? The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, right? The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, CLIA, ensures the quality and accuracy of laboratory testing, right? CLIA applies to every human clinical laboratory in the United States. If you are testing any human blood or body fluids, you fall under the CLIA law. Under CLIA, all laboratories and clinics that do testing must be inspected. The only labs that do not need to be inspected are labs that only do waived testing. So if you work in a small clinic office that the only testing they do is waived testing, then you don't have to be inspected. But you still have to have that waived testing certificate. 3 categories tests fall into CLIA, under CLIA are those waived, which, like I said, you may not be inspected, but you have to have that certificate and you have to follow CLIA guidelines dealing directly with waived testing. Then there's those moderately complex tests, highly complex tests, right? Tests are categorized depending on the difficulty of conducting the test, the risk or harm to the patient if the test is not performed correctly. So, in this chapter, right, we talked about basic legal terms, we talked about consent, how to avoid litigation, right? Because that's the goal, is making sure that we do everything we can to never be involved in litigation to begin with, which means following all the things you learned in phlebotomy school, making sure that you follow your personal and professional ethics, and making sure that you follow your policies and procedures of your healthcare facility to the T. Making sure that you follow HIPAA guidelines, okay? We talked about liability insurance, and we talked about common issues and lawsuits against healthcare workers and prevention tips to avoid them. So now let's move on to Chapter 1, Part 2. Okay? Again, here's our learning objectives, right? So you guys make sure you read through these learning objectives, because these are the things that you should know when you finish reading Chapter 1, Part 2 in your textbook, watching this PowerPoint presentation, filling out your review guides and studying them. After you've studied those, these are the things that you should know, okay? Knowing your objectives is vitally important. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Okay, if y'all don't know about this, look it up and you can go into some depth. We're going to touch on it here, okay? What it's talking about is these are the needs that you need, and they're based, they move themselves up, right? The first thing is psychological needs, air, food, and water. And in other words, if you don't have enough food to drink, if you can't breathe, if you don't have water, these are the things you need to sustain life. And without those, you really can't do anything else. I mean, if you're on the verge of starving to death, or you don't have water, or you can't breathe, it's really going to be hard for you to do anything else in your life. Those needs need to be met first, okay? Then next, safety and security. If you don't feel safe and secure, it's going to be difficult for you to do other things, right? Then the next thing is you need to be loved. You need to feel belong to a community or a family. From there, you want to build that self-esteem. You need to feel good about yourself before you can move into self-actualization, okay? To process from one need to another, the most basic needs must be satisfied. Those needs, those psychological needs, that safety and security and that love, all needs to be met before you can move into the others. So what is quality? Okay? It's excellence, it's high standards, and it's superiority, right? You want to have quality. Quality in healthcare can be considered in two categories, okay? Scientific and interpersonal. Scientific deals with how well clinical skills are applied to the situation. For example, how well the healthcare worker picks the correct equipment and technique for drawing patients' blood, okay? Interpersonal deals with whether services are convenient and timely, or if the patient is satisfied with the comfort or safety of the environment, okay? Quality of phlebotomy services focuses not only on meeting a minimum standard, but also on constantly improving services that are provided. Now let's go through a couple of things. Let's talk about some stuff. Stakeholders, okay? What are stakeholders? They can be customers, right? Or individuals or groups that have an interest in quality healthcare services. You have external stakeholders, such as your local community. Communities need clinics and hospitals, right? So they are there, it's important to them, right? So they're stakeholders in this, okay? They have an interest in having good quality hospitals and good quality physician's office. You think about if you're in a rural area and you have a small hospital there, you're an external stakeholder for that hospital because it is of great interest to you to keep that hospital, because you don't really want it to end up closing, because then you may have to drive hours to go to a hospital. Then there's internal stakeholders, such as inpatients and outpatients that are within that healthcare organization. Also, the people who work inside that healthcare facility. So here's one of our situations, right, where we take what we're learning in lab and lecture and put it together to see if we're figuring these things out. So I want you guys to pause this, read through it, and see if you're getting the correct answer. Guys, it is important that you want to do a good job. Okay, that's something that can't be taught. It's inside you. It's almost like those, we talk about ethics, where you hear that voice talking to you, right? You have to want to be a healthcare professional. You have to want to do a good job, and you have to want to continue learning so that you can stay up on the latest and the best healthcare procedures out there that you can provide, so you can give your patient the best. Take pride in what you do. It is imperative that phlebotomists assume responsibility in continuous quality improvement. We want to continue to get better at all times. Some healthcare organizations have adopted specific quality improvement models, such as the Six Sigma, a method designed to improve processes, performance by reducing variation, improve quality by enhancing financial performance, and improving customer satisfaction. Quality improvement for phlebotomists involves these different things. Your technique, okay? You always want to get better and better and better at drawing blood. You always want to get better at IDing your patients. You always want to get better at your patients' wait times. You want to get better at getting your patients into your chair, being able to show them the best customer service. You don't want them to feel like you're rushing, but you also want to be able to get them in the chair, draw their blood quickly with the best techniques, using the best safety protocol, get them out of your chair where they feel like they've been taken care of properly, you did everything right, and you get your next patient in the chair, so you cut down on those wait times. You want to improve on complications such as hematomas. You want to decrease your recollection and repeat rates. You want to get to the point where you're not having to stick a patient but one time, right? And that you're not being sent back to recollect that patient sample because it was hemolyzed, right? You want to be able to catch duplicate test orders and make sure that you're not sticking these patients more times than they need to be stuck. You want to be a part of that healthcare team and be able to voice your opinion and let people know if you see something that's not right. So we're still talking about perceptions of quality, right? So poor patient outcomes should be avoided. The 5 D's of poor patient outcomes are, starting at the top, okay, most important, death. We want to avoid anything that we could do that could cause death, that could cause disease. We want to break that chain of infection and make sure we're not causing nosocomial infections. We want disability. We don't want, not only do we not want them to get a disease or die, but we don't want us to do anything that would disable our patients. We don't want to cause them discomfort, okay? And that comes with improving your technique. The better at phlebotomy you get, then the less discomfort your patient has. And like I told you, any job you do involves customer service. We want them to be satisfied when they leave. We do not want our patients dissatisfied, because honestly, there is other hospitals they can go to, other doctors and other clinics, and we want them to come back to our clinic because this helps us get raises and helps us improve our salaries. So what are the tools for quality performance assessment? So tools for implementing continuous quality improvement. We have flow charts, which are, there's a picture there up there at the top, over to the right, is breaking a process down into its components. It flows from one process to the next, and these flow charts can show you at a site, just looking at it quickly, how things flow from one thing to the next. You have paleo charts, which you see down there at the bottom over to your right, which are bar charts that show the frequency of problems. The paleo principle says that 80% of the trouble comes from 20% of the problems. If you drink in a bar, often you have a problem, right? But we can see if we see we have a lot of hematomas, and then we end up putting together something to improve that, to decrease that number and improve our performance, then we want to track those numbers so we can see if what we're doing is working. Because if it is, we should see a decrease in the number of hematomas over time, and that shows us whatever we implemented is actually working. Okay, guys, we're talking about tools and trends for performance assessment. We need to assess people's performance, okay? It's just like if we're tracking, because if these patients have hematomas, we should be filling out an incident report. So we should be tracking any of these. So in the month of January, if we had 30 hematomas and we determined that we want to decrease the hematomas we see in our patients, and we put forth some type of policy or procedure aimed at decreasing those hematomas in our patients, then we need to have some kind of tool to assess whether the performance is getting better, whether we have a decrease in those hematomas, right? So cause and effect, or Ishwana diagrams. And you see that diagram over here to your right at the top. And it talks about problems leading to recollection, right? So we want to identify that interaction between, is it the equipment that's causing the issue? Is it the methods that's causing the issue? Is it the person or person? Is it the supplies? What is causing that issue? Okay? And then plan, do, check, act, right? This is a cycle of assessing and making positive changes, then reassessing, right? Because you plan, come up with a plan. What's our plan for decreasing hematomas? Okay, then you set that plan into motion. If it is education, then you need to set up a time to educate and train your employees, and you want to have it documented. Who was there, what you taught them, right? And then you check the plan to see if there's improvement. In January, if there was 30, in February, you hope there's 20. In March, there's 10, right? And then you act on those results. And in other words, if I had 30 in January and 30 in February and 35 in March, then I need to act, because those results are not giving us what we need. So we need to change whatever we were doing. That procedure that we implemented is not working. Okay, so we need to implement another procedure. And then we'll still keep tracking and hope that we see, but you must act on it. You can't just put a plan in place and never go back and see if that plan is working or not. Because if it is working, then that's fine. If it is not working, it needs to be tweaked, modified, or changed. So then we have line graphs, histograms, scatter diagrams, graphs representing performance, right? You can have that bar graph that shows that your hematomas are going down or up or staying the same. And you can also have different kinds of line graphs and scatter graphs that can show you the same thing. And then remember, what is brainstorming? Brainstorming is that method of stimulating creative solutions. And my belief is, if we're having an issue with some type of phlebotomy procedure, then those end users, those phlebotomists, need to get with their phlebotomy supervisor, and they need to sit down and have a meeting and brainstorm ways that they see that they can eliminate this problem. Okay, laboratory testing cycle, okay? So we're talking about examples of pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical factors affecting the quality of laboratory test results. We've talked about these phases before many times. Our pre-analytical phase is those phases that are definitely involved in your job as a phlebotomist. Properly identifying your patient, okay? Making sure you're using the correct phlebotomy technique, is applying your tourniquet in the proper site, choosing the appropriate equipment, depending, you know how I tell y'all, you're not even going to know. That's why you don't get your supplies out, right? The first thing we do is get that tourniquet on the arm and find the vein. What kind of vein is it? Am I going to need a butterfly? Am I going to need a straight needle? You know, is it roll a lot? Is it, you know, you need to know all these things before you can pick out the appropriate equipment. And then transportation variables. Does it need to be protected from light? Does it need to be transported on ice? Does it need to get to the lab stat? And then processing and storage. We want to make sure we process our samples. We need to let them clot if they need to clot. We need to make sure they're mixed appropriately. We need to make sure they're spun down at the appropriate RPMs at the appropriate time, and they're stored appropriately. Then you have that analytical phase. So those pre-analytical phase, that stuff, all the stuff that happens before we test that blood, right? The analytical phase is that testing reliability and accuracy, and we do that making sure we calibrate, maintenance our machines, and run our controls, right? Post-analytical phase is reporting out your results, making sure you go over those results before you report them out, look for critical values, and make sure they're reported in a very timely fashion. And then you follow up or repeat test anything that is of a critical value. The first thing you want to do is repeat it to make sure it is correct. We understand that quality control is not only vitally important, but it is a key component for the lab to provide good quality assurance, right? And we understand that quality control follows under quality assurance. Remember, quality assurance is that patient's being taken care of and having good healthcare outcomes and satisfaction from the time their feet hit the floor in the parking lot coming into the building to when we roll them out in the wheelchair and discharge them out home, and all the things in between, including making sure all our equipment has quality control checks and quality control is ran on them. Everything from the thermometers all the way down to the needles and anything in between. Any equipment used to diagnose, monitor, or treat our patients must have quality control checks run on them. And remember, G value denotes the relative centrifugal force, right? 1,000 G's is what we need to make sure that we get proper separation of serum from cells or cells from plasma, right? And it's calculated on a chart called a nomogram. Okay, according to Knuckles, the amount of time a specimen should be spun is 5 to 10 minutes. The correct amount of whole blood to draw for a certain test is 2.5 times the amount of serum needed for the test. Okay? So if you need a meal of serum, then you're going to draw 2.5 times that in the entire tube of blood, right? You can usually get 2 to 3 tests from one tube of whole blood. So future trends in phlebotomy practice. There are growing attempts to standardize phlebotomy practice, such as providing international certification for phlebotomists, which we are now seeing through ASCP. The shift to electronic medical records is soon to become law, but will present problems related to security, standardization, and integration, especially in very small rural settings. Research efforts are towards smaller and faster with less waste. Many organizations now offer direct testing in non-traditional settings such as health clubs, grocery stores, pharmacies, religious facilities, and community centers. CE credits are now available online almost instantaneously. Now we're going to talk about decentralization. Okay? In the 1900s, many hospitals decentralized or moved phlebotomists from one central location to the different hospital floors. There's 5 advantages to decentralizations that we'll cover here. Okay? It helps improve the quality of care. It eliminates unnecessary cost. It increases communication between the phlebotomists and nurses and doctors and families and patients and all that, and perform duties of coordinated teams rather than a specialist. And guys, teams are vitally important in the healthcare setting to become more sensitive to the patient's individual needs and to allow faster point-of-care testing and collection of blood. There are unfortunately disadvantages to decentralization. Other workers not trained or resent extra work. It puts other healthcare workers at greater risk since they are not properly trained. It extends length of time for patient to get better. Does not eliminate extra cost. Specimens are not acceptable all the time. They're not labeled properly. They're not ID corrected, coag tubes not full, patients not drawn in the basal state, patient not fasting, wrong tubes, all these things that you're taught in phlebotomy school, they don't always teach all of that in nursing school. So a lot of times, if you decentralize the phlebotomy and have someone that is not a trained phlebotomist in all these things and kept up to date on the latest, then they may not be drawing this, which increases cost. Increases the time the patient has to be stuck. It decreases their length of getting better. It's just there is a lot of disadvantages to decentralization when you're using healthcare professionals that are not properly trained in phlebotomy. So, in the second part of this chapter, we talked about quality improvement and tools that help with quality improvement. Because I can't tell you how important quality improvement is. And not only for us to make sure we're tracking things, to see what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, but also to be able to implement policies and procedures in place to improve those numbers. And then making sure we're looking at that data so that if whatever we put into place is not giving us the results we want, then we need to tweak it, change it, modify it, whatever we need to do to make sure that we get the results we want. So now the last part of this is bioterrorism and emerging infectious diseases, right? And we always start with our learning objective. So make sure after you watch this PowerPoint presentation, read the bioterrorism section in your textbook, fill out your review guides and study those, that you're able to discuss bioterrorism and emerging infectious diseases. Okay, so first thing we want to talk about is bacterial bioterrorism agents. Okay, so in the aftermath of the 9/11 bioterrorism threat, all laboratories should perform a risk assessment. okay? So after 9/11 happened, these laboratories need to be able to do a risk assessment. What are they at risk for? And then how can they decrease that risk, right? Laboratories need to identify procedures and methods that have the potential to produce aerosol, which is those fine particles suspended in the air. Using biosafety cabinets or hoods to perform certain tasks in one way to avoid exposure of aerosols. But you will not know which specimens to use under those biosafety cabinets or hoods if you did not do a risk assessment and you're not sure on which one of these methods have the potential to produce those aerosols. So then you will know which ones you need to do under the safety hoods and cabinets. The CDC recommends referring any suspicious organisms or substances to the proper authorities and practicing the proper biosafety techniques at all times. Most of the bacteria, viruses, and toxins used as bioterrorism agents can be spread by an aerosol route, which is very stable. They also produce high morbidity, which is illness, and a high mortality, which is death rates. Other bioterrorism agents are transmitted person to person, and some are difficult to treat. Anthrax is caused by Bacillus anthracis, a gram-positive bacilla, which is a rod shape, that forms endospores. It is a disease of livestock who feed on plants contaminated with the organism. Human beings contract anthrax most of the time by contact with the animals or animal products. For this reason, it's called wool sorter's disease. Because as you can imagine, these people who were in there shaving the wool off the lambs and the sheeps, and then they were throwing them over. You can see where, like, when you take your rug and you shake it outside and the sunlight is coming, you can see all these particles floating in the air. That's what happened with these endospores that were on the wool of these sheep, because they had eaten these plants that were contaminated with them, and now those workers were in there breathing those endospores in, and they would contract anthrax. It is not spread person to person, but by contact with those spores. And so you see those up at the top to your right, those are the bacillus rods that you see under the microscope when someone has anthrax. And then livestock, whether it's cows or sheep, and pictures of those there. And then down at the bottom, there's a person with that anthrax disease. Before September of 2001, the last case of inhalation anthrax in the United States occurred in 1978. It had been a long time since any case of that had came up. But in September and October of 2001, anthrax was spread through letters in the mail. I don't know if you guys remember this. A number of people developed the cutaneous, which is that on their skin, right, form, and at least 10 contracted the inhalation form. Okay, 6 of these 10 survived, probably because they were treated early with the combination of antibiotics. 3 forms in human beings are, okay, the 3 forms. And guys, remember, when something first comes along like anthrax many years ago, the death rate is usually higher because we don't yet know what the right combination of medicines and treatments are to heal our patients and send them home quickly. It's the same thing we saw with COVID-19. That's why they referred to it as a novel disease, a novel virus, right? Because it was new to us. We hadn't seen this particular virus before. So at first, we don't know how to treat it. We don't know how to stop it. We don't know how it's spread. We don't know how it lives outside the body. So we're learning as we go. And unfortunately, when you see a new novel virus come into the population, a lot of people die because we don't know, right? But then as we learn and we grow and we find out this combination of medicines along with this particular thing work really well to get our patients better, and it spread this way and this helps and that helps, then we learn and we get better at saving these patients. So the amount of people infected may still be the same, but the death rate goes down. And what we hope is, as we learn ways to decrease the spread. Now, it won't stop the spread, but it decreases the spread. So what you're hoping is that by washing your hands and wearing a mask and socially distancing, it's not going to prevent the spread altogether, but if it will slow the numbers down, then you have less people testing positive for COVID, which means less people getting sick, which means less people going to the hospital, which means the hospitals are not overwhelmed. They can treat the patients better, more effectively, and less people die. So it's a multifactorial issue, and it takes multiple things working together to see it get better, right? So the three forms of anthrax are that cutaneous form that you saw in that picture, and you'll see that blister right there, right? They develop, it's blackened and scabby, right? Then there's inhalation or pulmonary, where you breathe it in, right? And then there's gastrointestinal, which you can get from eating the meat of these sheep or cows that are infected with anthrax. So emerging infectious diseases, because whether we like it or not, we're constantly having new emerging infectious diseases. You know, there was a time no one had heard of HIV. There was a time when most of us had not heard of Ebola or SARS or MERS or COVID-19. Luckily, though, usually pandemics like the Spanish flu and like what we've experienced with COVID-19 don't happen that often, luckily, okay? So, but we need to be aware of the threat, right? We need to know about any new diseases that are out there. We need to know about new infectious disease, how they occur, okay? Will they occur? We need to know all this. Some of the most important reasons for this trend are, why are we seeing so many new ones, right? Why? Okay, the growth of the human population. There's a lot of people on this earth, guys, and the more people you have, the more cramped, the more waste, okay? It just breeds infection, right? The rise in international travel. Now you can hop on an airplane, and if the incubation period is a few days for this disease, another way, you have the disease, but you haven't developed symptoms to it yet, so you don't know you're sick, right? You hop on an airplane, you fly somewhere, okay? You're sick, you spread it there, you get back on the airplane, you come back home, you spread it there, right? And then environmental changes, global warming, the increase in temperature. We've seen more hurricanes, more fires, hotter temperatures. These are all things that are going to affect us in the long run. Some emerging and severe diseases may be that you're aware of, right? We talked about these: SARS, Ebola, hantavirus, which is a highly fatal respiratory infection occurring in the southwest U.S. And that's why, guys, if you're in your shop or you're in your barn or you're in your shed or outside and you're sweeping it up, make sure you wear a mask, because things like rat droppings, and you may have a few rats out in your storage building, and if you go out there to clean up, you want to make sure you wear a mask. So if you're sweeping, that dust is flying all around, you don't want to breathe that kind of thing in. Anytime you're working with anything that's going to cause a fine dust, fine particles, whether you're pouring concrete into a hole, it's going to have this powder. You don't want to breathe that in. Make sure you wear a mask. Then we have things like Escherichia coli, which causes hemolytic uremic syndrome, severe anemia and kidney failure, and then, of course, HIV and stuff in between, hepatitis C, right? Ebola virus, that's a viral hemorrhagic fever. It's the most lethal agent known to man. It is caused by the Ebola virus. Okay, transmission occurs with direct contact of infectious body fluids such as blood, urine, semen, and saliva. The disease is characterized by a very high fever and extensive bleeding and destruction of your internal organs. We know that the Ebola virus is zoonotic, okay, which means that it comes from animals, right? Animals to us. It hops from that animal to us, right? Bats are the most likely reservoir. We feel like that's the most likely reservoir for SARS and for COVID-19. They pass the infection to other animals and then spread by infected wild animals to humans, following this human-to-human transmission after that. So once it jumps species from like a bat to something else, such as a deer, and then we may either come in contact with the deer or eat the deer meat, then we get it, and then we can pass it from one person to another. It presents with an acute onset, typically 8 to 10 days after exposure. The range is 2 to 21 days, but it's usually within 8 to 10 days of you being exposed, you have acute onset of your symptoms. And they include fever, chills, malaise. You start getting anorexia because you can't eat. After about 5 days, you have GI symptoms such as nausea, vomiting. You have diarrhea and abdomen pain. You have headache, all kinds of stuff, down to seizures. And in 18% of the cases, you have that hemorrhagic symptoms where you're bleeding from your gums, your nose, your ears. And here's some pictures of this, right? Hematemesis is that vomiting blood. You start bleeding at your IV site. They're giving you IV fluids to try to save your life, and then you start bleeding from that. And then gingivital bleeding, which is in your gums and your teeth. PPE required by the CDC for protection from Ebola virus is your surgical gown, surgical hood that completely covers the head and neck, full face shield, not goggles, and an N95 respirator. The CDC now recommends physicians rigorously train and demonstrate competency at both donning and doffing that PPE. The PPE is not going to work if you do not have it properly on, okay? A trained monitor should oversee every time a healthcare worker puts on or takes off their PPE. These are just some reporting dates, total cases, confirmed cases, and total deaths caused by the Ebola viruses in different regions in Africa, including the United States. In October, we had 4 of those total cases, 4 confirmed, and we had 1 death from it. When we talk about that viral hemorrhagic fever pathogen, down here at the bottom is a picture of that filovirus. It's non-segmented. It's an RNA virus. It's the severest disease with high fatality rate. No specific treatment or vaccine. The 2014 West African Ebola outbreak was caused by the Zaire Ebola virus species. There are 5 known Ebola virus species. Because the difficulty with viruses is sometimes they can mutate and change the way they're transmitted, change the way they present, and change their fatality rate. Human-to-human transmission, okay? Like I said, it's a zoonotic. It usually jumps from one animal to another and then ends up going to humans. From there, humans can transmit it to other humans. Infected persons are not contagious until the onset of symptoms. Thank God. Infections of body fluids increase as patients become more ill. The issue is a lot of people may start to feel ill, like I don't feel good, I feel tired and run down, and literally you're running a fever and you don't know it, so now you're contagious. Remains from deceased infected persons are highly infectious, and human-to-human transmissions of Ebola virus via inhalation aerosol has not been demonstrated, thankfully. So let's look at the clinical features, okay? It's non-specific early symptoms, progress to, right? Hypovolemic shock and multiple organ failure, hemorrhagic disease, and death. Non-fatal cases typically improve in 6 to 11 days after symptoms onset, and fatal disease associated with more severe early symptoms. The fatality rates of 70% have been reported in Africa. Intensive care, especially early intravenous and electrolyte management, may increase the survival rate. So we went over chapter 1, part 2. We went over chapter 3, and we went over bioterrorism and emerging infectious diseases. And we know now we have faced COVID-19 and the pandemic that has came from that. COVID-19 is a relative of the SARS and MERS viruses. Guys, make sure you stay as up-to-date as humanly possible on any of those emerging infections. Because it's like I tell people, if an infection breaks out in Africa, or if like Ebola, or if an infection breaks out like MERS or SARS or COVID-19 in Asia, in parts of Asia or China. It's not going to stay there most likely. Diseases don't care about the color of your skin or how much money you do or do not have, or what church you attend, or frankly, where you live. It is just a plane ride away from showing up all over the world. And we have to be prepared for the diseases. And one of the ways you can prepare yourself is making sure you know how to properly use your personal protective equipment. Making sure that you wear the appropriate personal protective equipment. Okay? Making sure you change your gloves, wash your hands. Okay? Guys, the sanitation procedures from hand washing to gloves to wearing the appropriate PPE are not only going to decrease the spread of these infections, but they're also going to protect you, the patient, your co-workers, and visitors and relatives to that hospital. Also, guys, when you're out there, make sure just in your everyday life, you're making sure that you wash your hands. You spread the word on washing your hands. You teach your children to wash their hands. Okay? Make sure that you're cleaning your home and your areas, especially when you're cooking, and make sure you have different cutting boards. Have one cutting board that you use for your meats and a separate cutting board that you use for your vegetables. Don't interuse the two. Make sure that you clean appropriately your hands and your surfaces when you're dealing with meat, okay? Because that's the way a disease can go from an animal to you, okay? So you guys take care of yourself. Make sure you're wearing your mask. Make sure that you're staying 6 feet apart. Take those precautions for yourself and others and your loved ones. Be careful when you're out there working. And guys, remember, okay? We're going to get a vaccine soon, okay? And vaccines are a good thing. Make sure you're vaccinating your children. And when that vaccine becomes available to the general public, I implore you, do your research. Make sure your research is coming from a viable source, okay? Make sure the National Institute of Health, PubMed, make sure you're checking reliable sources so that you will know that these vaccines are safe for you and your family. Okay, we eradicated smallpox. No one has smallpox anymore. You never hardly hear about people having diphtheria, mumps, measles. It's because those vaccines work, guys. Polio isn't killing people anymore because we were vaccinated as children against polio, okay? So don't let people talk you into not looking at the history. People ask me all the time, why do we learn history? So we don't repeat the same mistakes we've made in the past. And we've seen that the reason we don't see people crippled with polio all over the United States anymore is because we were vaccinated against polio. And if we want to make sure that we decrease the chances of ourselves, our loved ones getting COVID-19 or any other infectious disease, we need to make sure that we are cleaning, that we are using our appropriate PPE out there in the hospitals, and that we're getting vaccinated. So you guys make sure you watch your videos, fill out your review guides, and study those review guides because there will be questions on your comprehensive final on this. But remember, there will not be an individual test on these chapters. You guys have a great day.